Hello dear students. Today our lecture is on domestication of plants. After going through this lecture, you will be able to understand how environmental changes paved the way for the domestication of animals and plants, problems and issues concerning the process of domestication, how one can identify the domesticated series of plants and animals from archaeological records, various aspects of plant domestication. Now we will see climatic changes in early Holocene. Control and involvement by humans over plants and animals was essential to the domestication process. It is important to keep in mind that this adaptation didn't occur in a vacuum when the Pleistocene epoch ended, nor did it immediately transform the nomadic lifestyle of hunter-gatherers into a sedentary one centered on a community of houses. The morphological makeup of plants has been significantly altered by environmental changes. Because of this, many plant and animal species underwent noticeable morphological changes throughout the late Pleistocene era some 19,000 years ago. Global climate changed during the late Pleistocene epoch. The rise of neothermal climatic conditions, which can be either hot or cold, dry or moist, has been used to characterize these worldwide climatic shifts. Temperature and sea levels rose dramatically during the last glacial period, which lasted from around BC 12,700 to BC 10,950. The temperature shift put an end to the cold phase known as the Warm Glacial, which lasted from 11,700 to 11,500 years. This era marked the end of the glacial period in the alpine area. The Younger Dryas interval followed, lasting from around 10,950 to 9,650 BCE. While this was happening, there was a brief period of extremely cold weather, followed by a return to warmer conditions. These changes have far-reaching effects on the global landscape. The retreat of the Scandinavian ice sheets, which crashed the Earth's crust and caused the North Sea to flood, opened broad portions of North America and Northern Europe to human occupation after 1 lakh years. Vegetation changed around the planet as a result of regional temperature and precipitation shifts. Recent research suggests that at the start of the Holocene, carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere had already risen to levels not seen since the end of the Pleistocene. Plants flourished during the Holocene because of improvements in photosynthesis, biomass, and seed production, as well as increased tolerance for climate extremes. The finest examples of the Pleistocene's megafauna, which finally went extinct, were the mammoth, the woolly rhinoceros, and the bison in Central and Western Europe. The reindeer migrated to the Alps and Apennines when the ice sheets retreated, seeking cooler climates. Their extinction paved the way for smaller deer species like the red deer and roe deer. Changes were also occurring in the tropics. The populations of many wild animals, including gazelles, sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs, all rose. In order to survive the climatic shifts and food shortages of the early Holocene, hunter-gatherers diversified their diet and relied on a wide range of economic activities, including specialized hunting, seasonal collecting, and fishing and fowling. Different Mesolithic economies throughout the world are examples of this kind of alterations and adaptations. The fossilized remains of plants and animals, the tools employed by hunter-gatherers and fishers throughout that period, and their burial practices all provide evidence of cultural shifts in the early Holocene. Now, we will discuss about questions concerning domestication. A protracted sequence of communal experiments conducted over many generations of men, women, and children and spanning hundreds, maybe thousands of years, led to the domestication of both animals and plants. The individuals who participated in these studies make the crucial decisions and altered their food acquisition methods will never be identified by name. But the procedures they initiated were one of humanity's greatest triumphs. Animals and plant domestication were already well underway by the time archaeology began recording the history of these practices. Although many elements of this transition from hunting and gathering to domestication remain elusive, fragmentary evidence from throughout the world has allowed for some reconstruction. A new era in the history of humankind's interactions with plants and animals began with the domestication of plants and animals. It entailed taking plants and animals out of their natural environments and then selectively breeding and raising them in controlled circumstances for economic advantage. Plant collecting is not the same as plant domestication, and the same goes for animal husbandry. A stage of food gathering occurs when grain is gathered and consumed entirely. Plants become domesticated when some of the harvested grain is used for food and the remainder is saved to be planted on purpose. Animal keeping involves capturing and maintaining animals. Domestication occurs when formerly wild animals are captured, taken away from their native habitat and raised in captivity for economic gain. The proportion of people who rely on agriculture and livestock farming as opposed to hunting and gathering has been increasing throughout time. For instance, the evolution from basic to complicated foraging provided context for the first attempts at plant domestication, with the later signifying an era of extensive exploitation of wild plants. Then, agriculture progressed to its nascent stage and eventually to its mature state. Changes in technology, food supply, population, the size and density of human settlements, and social and political organization all increased over time as a result of these trends. There must have been many hundreds, if not thousands of years between the first successful domestication of plants and animals and the subsequent growing reliance on these resources by the local population. It is possible to differentiate between cultures who acquire a marginal portion of their food from animal and or plant domestication and those that obtain a sizable portion. The latter are examples of food-producing communities. A society can be considered food-producing if it provides for at least half of its annual food demands through the domestication of animals and or plants in a situation where the animals and plants are not limited to their natural environment. Since reliable data on prehistoric communities is lacking, it is impossible to know with any certainty to what degree a given community relied on domestication to meet its nutritional needs. Now, recovering floral and faunal evidences and problems of their identification. Over generations, domesticated animals and plants may undergo noticeable physical modifications. As a rule, early domesticators of animals are smaller than their wild relatives. When this happens, the face shrinks in proportion to the skull. Alterations are made to the teeth, with certain teeth such as the premolars and third molars perhaps disappearing and others shrinking in size. Horns typically shrink over time. When compared to draft animals, domesticated cattle have weak muscle ridges and poorly defined joint facets. When an animal is domesticated, its hair becomes shorter and its coloring shifts. These morphological modifications are not immediately obvious in the early phases of domestication, but rather occur only after the process has been going on for a considerable amount of time. Estimates suggest that it took the domestication of the horse thousands of years before any noticeable change occurred, but the domestication of cattle, goats, and sheep resulted in behavioral modifications more quickly. However, once these shifts become evident, archaeologists are typically able to analyze the animal bones and teeth discovered at a site and determine not only what species they represent, but also whether or not the animal was wild or domesticated. When bones of wild or transitional forms of an animal are also found at a place, it simplifies the work of identifying the bones of a domesticated variant of that species. Scientific investigation of skeletal remains isn't the only approach to determine animal domestication. Domestication is suggested when wild animals are discovered in an unnatural environment, such as mountain goats on the lowlands. The proportions of different ages and sexes reflected in the faunal assemblage may also be instructive. In the wild, there are equal number of males and females among animals. When they are bred, however, the males and castrated animals are murdered at an early age, while the females are slain when they are elderly. The fossil record of animals provides evidence of these trends. The same way that there are distinguishing features between wild and domesticated animals, there are also distinguishing features between wild and domesticated plant grains and seeds. Certain morphological changes occur in plants under domestication settings over extended periods of time. Wild wheat and barley, for example, have bigger grains than their domesticated counterparts. The ears of wild wheat and barley are so brittle and the spikes so delicate that they fall off as soon as the plants reach maturity. This is the most efficient means by which plants disperse their seeds in nature. Domesticated wheat and barley, on the other hand, have ears that remain intact until the threshing process. The chances of survival and identification in the archaeological records are not the same for all plant species. Root crops like potatoes and yams don't have any tough parts, so they are less likely to survive. They may have so many diverse variations that it is difficult to identify between wild and domesticated ones, and since they reproduce asexually, they may not suffer significant genetic changes throughout the process of domestication. Careful study of grains or seeds discovered at a place, especially those that become carbonized owing to contact with fire, can provide direct proof of plant domestication. The domestication of a species can be determined by analyzing grain or husk imprints on pottery shards or clumps of clay. Evidence like as depictions of people catching or caring for animals, harvesting grain, or preparing food might be interpreted as indirect proof of animal or plant domestication. In any case, none of these provides sufficient evidence to draw any firm conclusions. Capturing an animal may represent a hunting expedition. Caring for animals could represent an early stage of animal husbandry, and gathering grains and preparing food would fit well into a narrative about gathering food. Some artifacts and tools, like as grinding stones and sickles, are sometimes considered as proof of plant domestication. However, this is not always the case. Wild grain can be ground with a grinding stone, and plants may be harvested using a sickle. Changes in land use, and by extension the existence or absence of agriculture, can be inferred from scientific evidence such as pollen grains, molluscs, insect remnants, etc. However, determining a community's food production capacity is more challenging and subjective. While evidence for the significance of animal and or plant domestication in the subsistence foundation of some locations is evident, in many other situations, the data is insufficient to make a judgment. We may never be able to completely understand the processes of animal and plant domestication or identify the impulses that lay behind them, given the limits of the evidence and the fact that we are looking at extremely slow, gradual processes that must have varied in pace and detail. It is also crucial to keep in mind that the archaeological evidence typically gives little hard data on social and political issues that may have played a major influence in the case of complicated cultural processes. Locating the domestication process as it evolved across geographic areas is more significant than pinpointing a single cause responsible for its beginnings. It is probable that distinctive variables were at play in the many early plant and animal domestication hotspots across the planet, given the wide range of ecological conditions and available resources at each site. Now, we will discuss domestication of plants. We still know very little about adaptation in the context of domestication, despite the fact that the domestication of plants has played an essential part in the progression of human history, and that just a few number of agricultural plants are of significant value to modern society. The process of domesticating plants has a significant impact on the development of human history. The ability of plants to be cultivated was absolutely necessary for the transition from hunter-gatherer tribes to agricultural civilizations, and it was a driving force behind the development of cities and modern civilization. Even today, people in a variety of locations, including Central America, New Guinea, and the Fertile Crescent, depend on crops that were first tamed and domesticated more than 10,000 years ago. However, the survival of modern humans depends on an astonishingly limited number of plant species. In most cases, very little information is available on the domestication of these crops, despite the crucial relevance of these plants. Some apparent queries are directed for the domesticators, and they are as: first, who were these people? Second, how did they determine that the crop was beginning to develop? Third, what kind of farming practices did they employ? Other questions pertaining to the history of crops: who or what was the wild ancestor of the crop that we grow today? Was there more than one instance of domestication? If so, in what place? The use of phylogeographic techniques is starting to provide light on the solutions to the later set of issues. Plant seeds and remains were discovered at the Nahal Oren site in Israel about 20,000 years before. These findings suggest that even when humans were still predominantly nomadic, they may have selectively cultivated some plant species. Large seeded grasses were accessible as a result of changes in vegetation in some regions of West Asia after 20,000 years before present. The seeds of these grasses were notorious for dispersing across a wide region. The spikes that contain the seeds on plants, like wild wheat and barley, grow brittle when this happens repeatedly. Even before the plants are mature, the seeds are spread. You may collect the seeds of the exploding plants by tapping the stem with a stick. Plants of a shattering type or those with natural means of dissemination would benefit from selective pressure if their seeds were spread. Alterations to farmed wheat have been described by Weinke. He believes domestication of wheat, one of the world's most important crops, involved both human manipulation and natural hybridization between relative genera. Human intervention appears to have been aimed at producing pre-threshing, non-shattering varieties. The simplest wheats are diploid, meaning that they have two sets of 7 chromosomes. Hybridization with related species produced tetraploid wheats with 4 sets of chromosomes. Hybridization eventually produced hexaploid wheats with 6 sets of chromosomes, which occur only in cultivated species of wheat. By mixing genetic material from various species, early farmers produced forms of wheat that could adapt to diverse habitats. Few natural plants have a gene that produces tough spikes that are not brittle. These plants have long-lasting seeds, but they don't spread very far in the wild. When hunter-gatherers were gathering edible plants to supplement their nutrition some 20,000 years ago, it was advantageous to pick plants with strong spikes and undamaged heads. However, extra work was needed to grow these plants. These wild cereals, along with a variety of other plants, have flourished in hilly areas with well-drained loamy clay soil. However, in order to minimize competition among these plants, the seeds of the cultivated plants had to be spread in locations separate from the wild, self-seeding plants. It was necessary to get the seeds to flatter land that was in close proximity to dependable water sources and to an area that received an appropriate amount of precipitation. The Piedmont of the Fertile Crescent region, which came to sustain the Neolithic settlements of Syria, the upper reaches of the river Euphrates, and Jarmo on the Zagros Mountains all supplied the ecological circumstances in which these plants were able to grow. Evidence of this can be found in the form of wheat grains that have since decomposed. These plants feature sharp spines, and other than that, they are indistinguishable from their wild counterparts. They are discovered in locations that are remote from the natural habitat of the species in question. Because of human interference, the gene pool of these plants has become much more diverse. In addition to this, it brought to light the crucial part that humans play in the process of cultivation. In a similar vein, the potentialities inherent in food farming for the creation of a more complex society as a result of protracted stay in a given location and the preservation of the harvest eventually affected the existence of people. This was caused by the combination of these two factors. Early agricultural sites in Israel and Syria, such as native Hagdud and Abu Huraira respectively, provide some of the earliest evidence of the domestication of plants. These early agricultural sites date back to between 10,500 and 10,000 BCE, and where the locations where sophisticated hunter-gatherers made their first attempts at plant cultivation. Examples of seeds and plants that were carefully grown very early on in human history include wild incorn and immer wheat, barley and rye. This was a time when humans were mostly nomadic. The northwestern region of Iran, northern Iraq and southern Turkey all saw similar events at the same time. It is possible to draw parallels between the process of domesticating plants and the manner in which seeds were dispersed to additional regions that are located in close proximity to dependable water sources or to regions that receive an adequate amount of rainfall and are suitable for the development of these plants. Wheat, barley, and peas are credited with being the first plants to be tamed and domesticated in Southwest Asia around 10,000 years ago. These plants were the first to be domesticated because the characteristics of their wild progenitors made it possible for them to be the plants that could be tamed with the least amount of effort. It is believed that the wild progenitors of these crops were edible, produced high yields, and were simple to grow or sow. They had a rapid growth rate, could be harvested in a few months after being planted, and were simple to put away once collected. They needed just a moderate amount of genetic modification in order to be tamed and kept as pets. In most cases, they were capable of self-fertilization, ensuring the advantageous characteristics were not diluted in the process of reproduction with other plant species. The most important modifications that occurred genetically were the production of stalks that did not break and had constant quick germination. With this, we come to end of today's lecture. Thank you.